Welcome to the Nexus Project, a contemporary marketing conversation with John Ghiorso.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Nexus Project. I'm your host, John Ghiorso. And on today's episode, I interview Brady Brim-DeForest. Brady is a serial entrepreneur and technologist on a mission to transform the future of innovation. He's the CEO of Formula.Monks and co-founder at Monks. And through his career, Brady has helped pioneer the application of agile development, lean product design, and autonomous teams at enterprise companies, enabling global scale institutions to design, build, and ship competitive products at startup speeds. He's led technology solutions for clients like AT&T, American Express, Caterpillar, Cisco, Disney, Fox, Nielsen, and Ubisoft, as well as platform and product architecture that powers numerous Fortune 500 companies across the finance, telecom, media, and healthcare verticals. Brady is really an expert in this stuff, but has a really kind of global long-term view on the arc of technology and its impact on the world. Brady and I have a wide-ranging discussion, all centered around AI and its impact on the world. We talk about, is software going to go away? How are people going to interact with computers 10 years from now? Spoiler alert, it looks very different than it does today. Maybe doesn't involve screens at all. We talk about then the implications of that on technology, on marketing, on agencies, and individual work, individuals' jobs and careers, and what people focus their time on 10 years from now, because it's not what they focus their time on today in a lot of cases. So it's a future-looking, wide-ranging, but still very much grounded in true, credible, practical expertise. So I think for anyone in the marketing world, technology world, or just in business, you're going to get a ton of value out of this episode. So without further ado, here we go. Brady, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate you having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive right into it. AI is kind of the big topic in our industry right now, I think for good reason. Just to kind of set the stage, where do you sit in terms of your bearishness? It's overhyped, bullishness, it's going to change the world, maybe on a 1 to 10 scale. Where do you sit in terms of AI and its impact on agency, marketing, creative, et cetera?
From my vantage point, John, I'm all in on AI. I would say I'm a solid 10. I'll caveat that by saying I don't think it's going to change us the way that a lot of people are concerned that it might. I take maybe a contrarian perspective on what AI will do and its impact on the workforce, its impact on the creative economy.
Okay, let's dive into that a little more. So workforce, how do you feel about this? I know there's a lot of, to be honest, in my opinion, a bit oversimplified conversation of AI is going to take our jobs. I think the world's a lot more nuanced than that, but where do you sit on that?
I'm right there with you. I think anytime you have a step change in technology, it's always accompanied by fear. People are concerned about what the future on the other side of it might look like. And when you're heading into the center of the storm, it's really hard to imagine what the other side looks like. So really natural that people have anxiety. But with every step change, I think what we find is that human talent is repurposed for other higher meanings. And I think AI will be the same. It's as fundamental as the introduction of electricity. Yeah. No one lost their jobs when electricity came along. We just had to stop doing a lot of the really mundane, monotonous work that enabled us to then work on much more interesting problems and challenges that we're actually better suited to solve.
Yeah. I have this framework that I just think it's really easy to envision the things that will go away when a new technology happens, because those are right in front of us. And I think it's much, much harder to envision the things that haven't yet been invented for humans to do that will ultimately replace that in terms of kind of a need for labor. And I don't know, we've seen this over and over again with different technologies. I can point to a million examples. So I guess if that's the case, and I'll put you on the spot here a little bit because this is a hard one to answer, I think it's fair to say a lot of the work that happens today in the creative world will go away fundamentally. Like maybe not the jobs, but the individual tasks can be better done by software today than they could a year ago or 2 years before that, and certainly into the future. Assuming we're both right here and there's not going to be massive unemployment as a result of this, what are those future jobs? What do those future jobs look like?
Great question. I think the vast majority of knowledge workers' time today is spent doing things that could easily be automated with technology. But we fall, old habits die hard. And so we spend a lot of time doing things that we're comfortable doing that aren't really reflective of our higher purpose. So I think you're right, John, that a lot of the day-to-day is going to fundamentally shift because the machines, if you will, are going to be better at a lot of our jobs at scale. That doesn't mean, as you said, that the jobs are going away. It means that 80% time savings that I think, in an ideal world, AI might be able to deliver to the individual contributor is going to be spent doing the headier work. It's going to be spent doing the conceptual work, the thinking work, the work that machines actually aren't able to do as well as humans. And I'm not sure if they ever will necessarily be as good at doing as humans. That's not because machines won't have the capabilities. They're not as flawed as we are. Like, a lot of our brilliance is in the weaknesses of the human mind. AI is going to be eventually so much more capable than us, that the outcomes of the failures, the trial and error that humans use to learn, those things will be in a way iterated out of the machine. And so the truly creative moments in our industry, I think, are often created in a really roundabout way because our brains aren't as efficient as a machine. And so I think we're going to spend more of our time doing that kind of work, which I think is going to actually dramatically improve the human condition.
You mentioned this word creativity, which is obviously an incredibly important term, often defined differently depending on who you ask in our industry. But I think our industry's at this inflection point now where defining creativity is no longer an academic experience or an academic exercise. I should say it might actually be a practical exercise to say, if we're starting from the point of view, even this I think is questionable, that there is some kind of innate human creativity that, at least not now, not in the near future, can be replaced by software. What is that? Like, what are we trying to sort of maintain? What stays in the domain of humans? What gets disrupted by software? How are you thinking about that? And I guess through the context of also like a practical exercise. Because from what I've seen in my world, we're using generative AI a lot, and it's very good at production. It is not creative. I have seen no instance where generative AI is actually able to be creative. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I don't know. But where do you sit on that? Because I think that is like the single big question in our industry right now.
Yeah, I think for me, creativity is about the collisions in the human experience. When you're able to reflect on something through your lived experience, and it connects with your audience in a way that surprises and delights them. And I think the difference between humans and machines is machines aren't going to live the human experience. Machines don't have to wrestle with the realities of mortality. They don't have to wrestle with the challenges of our physical existence. And those experiences influence the way that we see the world. They influence and they color the experiences we have, and they give us a unique perception and perspective on the way that we interrelate with other humans. And I don't think there's ever going to be a time when machines will understand those things on a very fundamental level. They may be able to proxy them, but that's going to be because they learned those behaviors through humans. But if you ever interact with something that's a clone of something, there's always something unsettling about the experience because it's not authentic. And I think humans in particular, like we've evolved to be able to read really nuanced facial cues, right? For our own, for the safety and preservation of our lives and our families. And those nuances are incredibly complex and are things that we spend a lifetime learning because they matter. They actually impact our ability to survive. And that context, I don't think will ever be shared by machines in a meaningful, authentic way. So for me, creativity is all about the lived human experience and how that translates into moments of levity and humor and moments of deep reflection. And the content that really resonates with us does so because it forces us to address those parts of the human reality that are sometimes quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way of looking at it. I mean, if you break down these generative AI systems today, you kind of have the big variables are the amount of data that's input, the algorithms and the compute. I think you've got to assume the algorithms and the compute gets better over time, and the data will scale. But to your point, just inserting more and more text into a system or images or video, if you zoom out on this, leaves emotion and lived experience and the feeling of a breeze on your face, and there's actually this much larger world of data that humans are receiving every second of their lives. And then there's also the sort of get into the algorithm of, well, the machine doesn't have emotion, it doesn't have relationships, it doesn't have consciousness or any sense of kind of existentialism. So that's a really interesting I know that that may seem very kind of heady or philosophical, but I do think that's a really interesting framing of, yes, this stuff will get better, but there are some innate kind of limitations of ultimately what it's able to accomplish as a result. I don't know if I don't want to put words in your mouth,
No, I
but
no, I
is that a
completely
fair?
agree, John. I think that's a much more elegant way of explaining my rather roundabout explanation. But
uh,
I'm right there with you. I think that is the fundamental delta that I'm not sure machines will ever be able to cross because they are not humans.
Yeah. Well, then, and I don't know if we want to go here because it's maybe too theoretical and just total science fiction at this point, but
Let's go
what's
there.
your
Let's do
thinking
it.
on, okay. What's your thinking on AGI? Like, do we
Yeah,
get
I
there
think
in 5 years in our lifetimes? Is it unachievable because of these fundamental issues we're talking about?
I think that we will eventually get there. I think it may not be in our lifetimes. It could take another generation or two, but then again, it could happen much quicker. And that's what's so interesting about AGI. And when you think about the risks and the rewards that we're taking through the work that we're doing, on the very edges of artificial intelligence space, we're to a certain degree poking around blindly in the dark. Like we don't understand actually how our minds are designed, how the human brain works in any definitive sense, and the if you think about the mindscape, like the entire potential universe of minds that you could design, we're not really sure which minds are the ones we want to design.
Yeah.
And there's a non-zero probability that we could end up going down the very wrong path, one that could ultimately lead to very negative outcomes for humanity. But I'm not so worried about that. I think I'm more concerned about how we might put AGI to use, because without a physical manifestation, without a physical reality, AGI will be limited. It will still act through humanity. And I think that's where some of the most palpable risks lie, because as we've seen in the last decade, information is currency, and information and what information shared, what information isn't shared, has a tremendous impact on society. And AGI will have tremendous capability when it comes to changing the conversation and directing the conversation that takes place on a civilization-wide scale. And I think that is something that we need to be fundamentally very concerned with. Time horizons, I think, are ultimately going to be most impacted by, in my opinion, the evolution of quantum computing. And the further we get down the quantum computing path and the faster we accelerate down the path, I think the faster AGI will come. But again, it could be 10 years, it might be 30. Hard to know.
Interesting. Okay, so you think the one of the fundamental constraints right now then is compute on AGI. The software isn't enough based on the current kind of paradigm of computing.
Yeah, I think that it's actually more fundamental than that. I think it's energy constraints. AGI will have such a vast capacity to consume energy, and we don't necessarily have the capacity to deliver it. So in order for AGI to really evolve, we need more efficient compute. Between the status quo and quantum computing, in my opinion, is the exponential upside in quantum computing will reduce the impact of the energy consumption that AGI will actually require.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. Okay, that's great. Let's bring it back to a maybe more practical, maybe not angle, but I think you said something that, and I'm going to quote you here, and I correct me if I'm misquoting you, but in our intro call, you said software's going away.
hmm
What did that's a that's a wild statement. What do you mean by that? Explain it. Like, on what timeline? How is that actually going to function? We talked about it, and I still don't have my head wrapped around it. So,
Yeah, happily. So, when you think about the experience that we have today, software is essentially abstraction layers upon infrastructure that in some cases has been around for 50, 60 years. A lot of the systems that we interact with as consumers, for instance, whether we're traveling on an airplane or we're buying insurance or we're depositing money into our checking account, those experiences are actually being powered by technology that has in some cases been in operation since the 1950s, which is a crazy thing to think about. But you've got software that is running mainframe infrastructure that still powers a significant portion of the core enterprise technology layer on a global basis that has never been end of life. The way technology and in particular software has worked is we've built layer upon layer upon layer. Each layer becomes another layer of abstraction. The interfaces that we interact with, the UI, the UX, are essentially the most recent evolution of that abstraction layer. In 10 years' time, I think that the interactions that we have with a visual user interface, pointing and clicking, touch, on a touch screen, on our phones, on other devices, I think that world is going away. We're going to be disintermediating the software experience from the user interface, the way we think about it. And software will actually become more pervasive, but it will become more transparent, and we'll be less conscious of the fact that we're interacting with software. And I think AI in particular is going to enable us to increase the level of abstraction from the software that sits underneath. So it's not necessarily that software is going away; it's that we're not going to be using it the same way that we do today. And I think that's a really exciting future for me, John.
Okay. So I've got to dive into this more. So when you're talking about software, let's start at the kind of the point at which most people interact with software, which is the front end, the UI. Is that going away because we'll start to interact with computers in a much more sort of natural way, where we just speak to it and tell it what we want? And I mean, is that the world that we're talking about kind of being replaced by software? And then what sits behind that? Is it still the same legacy systems and it just feels more natural, or does this go all the way back kind of through the stack?
I think it's two layers. One is the actual experience is going to change fundamentally, because the amount of time that we spend with screens is going to decrease, in my opinion, versus increase over the next 3 decades, which is a very controversial perspective, but it's one that I really fundamentally believe in. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's ultimately because the way that we interact with software is going to fundamentally change. There will be new ways of engaging technology, like Neuralink, it's at the very cutting edge today, but in 20 years, there will be, brain, hardware, software interfaces that enable us to think about things and receive information in ways that we can't even contemplate today. That's number one. Number two is software is incredibly fragile. And that's in part why we have layer upon layer and all these abstraction layers that try to make the underlying systems more usable at the end of the day. But that fragility is ultimately because of two things. One, the long cycle times to actually iterate on software. We think that software, we can iterate on it quickly, but in reality, anyone that's ever built a large scale bespoke piece of custom software knows that it's not very quick. It takes a tremendous amount of money, very large teams of very smart people, a long time to actually evolve software. And the decision making is curtailed and constrained by the decisions that were made in some cases decades ago. And that means that what we're left with is, in many cases, organizations that have to model their businesses after the software that constrain them. And that's really, interestingly, a fairly modern experience. If we rewind the clock 100 years, where you had more flexible tools that were less constrained by prior decision making, there's a lot more flexibility around business models, interestingly enough. And I think what we're going to see as the cost of software declines, the cost of custom software declines, off-the-shelf software will start to play a less critical role in the enterprise. And it ultimately translates into a future in which organizations can build and instantiate software on the fly in real time, where the cost of, the incremental cost of improving software is virtually zero, and the cost of building custom solutions is almost nothing. And at that point, off-the-shelf software that we rely on to run and operate our businesses today, will become a lot less valuable, not because it's inherently less valuable, but because the constraints are so costly.
So how is this, and let's peg it to maybe a 10-year from now time horizon. How does that broad phenomenon trickle down to the way consumers use platforms, apps, Amazon, TikTok, Microsoft Word, and not, obviously, we're not going to know specific examples, but generally, are consumers all having completely kind of bespoke, customized, natural experiences with these platforms 10 years out? Are they just kind of more sophisticated versions of what they look like today? Largely, you mentioned screens going away. Paint a little bit more of a picture of kind of how this is going to impact the consumer side of things.
Yeah, so I think from a consumer experience perspective, whether it happens in 5 years or 10 years or 15, it's hard to say. But I think the trajectory is ultimately that software becomes this transparent layer that facilitates outcomes and provides solutions. A reasonable example might be, imagine a future in which you have an AI companion and you need an answer to a question about a financial decision. That typically would require to turn to a software stack like maybe QuickBooks if you use it for your personal finance, and probably a phone call to your accountants and maybe even to your estate planner or financial advisor. So there's a lot of work that has to be done on a very manual basis. Like the experience isn't particularly fluid, but the real problem is the transport layer for the data and the underlying data infrastructure that exists. It's all completely outsourced today. Like you don't really own any of your data anymore. It's owned almost entirely. And I don't mean that from a purely like legal perspective and what the terms of service say. But if QuickBooks goes away and you've been using QuickBooks for the last 15 years for your financial, to manage your books, your financial data is basically gone. Maybe you, downloaded a backup, maybe you didn't, who knows? But like our data isn't owned by us anymore. And the complexity of actually building a personal data model is insane. And most of us don't have the financial resources or the time or the know-how to really build our own data foundation. What AI can do is actually create that framework for us that allows for the interchange of that information to all of these different disparate systems, so that instead of having to add your accountant to QuickBooks, call up your estate plan or your financial advisor and manually work through these matters to come to a conclusion, you can be advised in these decisions in near real time, because AI is playing a role of that connective tissue and is integrating your data backbone into all of these discrete ecosystems, able to assimilate the knowledge and use a decision framework to actually advise you on a decision, and do that in seconds as opposed to days or weeks.
I mean, that makes sense to me because it's pretty well represented in science fiction. I mean, if you look at Star Trek, if you look at other kind of, plenty of examples I'm sure we're all familiar with, sort of speaking to the, generally intelligent, maybe smarter than you in some ways, computer that just sort of pieces all these things together and answers your question and takes actions on your behalf. Does that also explain the comment you made earlier about you think we'll use less screens? Because a screen is kind of right now like a necessary artificial interface between you and a computer, but maybe in a perfect, more natural world, you just don't need it for a lot of use cases. Is that fair, or am I going
Absolutely.
in a weird
No,
direction?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the types of screens that we use are going to change. Today, when you think about the amount of time that we spend in front of a laptop or a desktop, if you're a knowledge worker, or the amount of time that most of us spend on our phones, it is the primary interface for all of our decision making, for all of our data, for all of our communication. I think that the amount of concentration is going to dissipate. We're going to have many more types of devices that we're interacting with, but the interfaces are going to be fundamentally different. But the exchange of data and information between them will be a lot more seamless. So you'll have access to your own kind of operating system across a whole plethora of different interfaces.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's always struck me that computing seems to be getting kind of closer and closer to the way humans naturally interact with the world. And that this maybe represents one step even closer to that, which is, I still think we, even in walking around in the woods and hunting a deer, we receive a lot of information through our eyes, but we're not really like putting, we're not taking action through visual means.
That's
like
right.
We are on a screen. So it still makes sense to me that we would, even in this perfect Star Trek science fiction world future, we would receive a lot of information visually, because it's really quick to understand something when you see a photo or video or visual representation, but that's actually a somewhat inefficient way of getting things done in kind of a perfect computing.
That's right. Yeah. I think you're right that we will continue to consume a lot of information that way, but we won't necessarily have to interact in the same ways to achieve a result. Today, you have to do a lot. There's a tremendous amount of manual effort using a screen that's required in order to action on anything. And I think that's the part that will fundamentally shift.
Yeah. I'm trying to find a transition here. Maybe there isn't an elegant one, which is a transition in and of itself, I suppose. How's the agency world going to be impacted by AI over the next 5 to 10 years? And, I know we're all probably a little bit biased here, but it strikes me that at a minimum, there's going to be a tremendous amount of disruption, maybe winners and losers in the mix. But how do you think this whole industry looks 5, 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think you're right that, with any change like this, there will be winners and losers. But I think it will be a lot more subtle. I think some pundits imagine there's a lot of potential crashing and burning for large holdcos in the future. I'm not so certain that that's the kind of disruption that we're going to see. I think it will be much more incremental, and I think it's going to be from the outside in. Technology is adopted, almost every time by ICs on the edge. So the individual contributors are going to pull technology up into an organization. And I think that's where the most disruption is going to occur initially, is the way they do their jobs is going to fundamentally change. Their efficiency, their productivity will increase in certain areas. And in others, they're going to have, as we said before, they're going to have more time to do the work that they really enjoy the most. And I think that disruption is actually really exciting because it means we're empowering creatives, we're empowering creators, and they're going to have a lot more bandwidth to do the kinds of transformational work that's going to impress and wow and surprise and delight clients. So I think the biggest change that I see is clients are going to get a lot more value. they're going to they're going to get a lot more raw creative output, and I think that's going to fundamentally make agencies more valuable to clients as opposed to less. I think there is a perception that AI is going to commoditize everything, and therefore it's going to put tremendous price pressure on agencies. And I think for a while that will be the case. But the agencies that actually lever AI and aren't afraid of it and go full steam ahead and use it to increase the scale and scope of their creative output are going to be the most desirable agencies for clients to work with. And so I think and if everyone does it, I think everyone benefits. I think those that are overly guarded about adopting technology because of all of the risks, I think are going to be the losers. Some much smarter than me said, playing for safety is the most dangerous thing in the world. And I completely agree. If you're worried about the downside, you'll never be able to capture the upside.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think that agency services, that's obviously a very broad term, but I think the demand is elastic. If you can produce 10 times more output or reduce your cost by 10x, either way, right? Like, I think there is then demand for that.
Absolutely.
Like, I think to your point, like it means that per person, per dollar, per whatever unit of measure, 5-10 years from now, there's just a massive increase in output.
That's right.
And that is effectively just absorbed by the clients, and theoretically they're getting a lot more value and they're happier. Although, as we know, everything's relative, right?
Totally.
Look at expectations around, shipping speed. Like, as a weird example, I remember an executive at Amazon said, when they first started, they would ship someone a book in 6 days and they would get an email and say, this was like a magic trick. I clicked a button on my computer and then it showed up 6 days later. And now if they have a 2-hour ship window and they're 10 minutes late, they get an angry email saying, where's my stuff? Anyway, kind of
just
random
kept raising
example,
the bar.
Exactly, right? So like the expectation is just, well, of course we have 10x, 100x the output. That's how the industry works. So yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, let's go to the not so rapid fire round, but we'll throw a couple weird ones at you. All right, in a business context, what do you believe deeply that most people disagree with you on? You've already said a few, so
yeah. So I that's a great question. No one's ever posed that to me before, John. It's entirely possible that a lot of people agree. I think a lot of people do agree with me with this, but I do think it's counter to traditional dogma. I think in a business, radical transparency always wins out, and it's a scary concept when you first cross over that threshold and put everything on the table for your entire organization. And there are of course constraints. You're operating in a listed environment. Of course, there are limits to this, but for the most part, I think the more transparent you can be, the more you empower and the more autonomy you give your team, and the better the organization ultimately is. Because when people understand the world in which they're working, they understand the constraints, they understand the realities, they're able to optimize their own behavior in a way that actually produces better outcomes. And if you just give someone a directive and say, we need to cut costs, and you don't tell them why, what are the stakes? What is the risk looming on the horizon, then humans don't actually usually make the best decisions. We need more input, and the more input we can give our teams, the more transparent we can be with the information, the better the result. Again, I don't think that's, I think a lot of people do agree with that, but I think certainly my experience has been most organizations tend to shy away from full transparency as a default.
Yeah, I like that. I like it a lot. 5 years from now, what emerging platform will business leaders regret not paying more attention to?
Ooh, that's a good question. When you say platform, I assume you're thinking consumer platform, or are you thinking
consumer platform?
Yeah.
So the perfect answer for this in 2018 would have been TikTok. The perfect answer in 2010 would have been Amazon, right? Like, what is your crystal ball? This thing is going to be much bigger than people realize.
Yeah.
And the time is now, but I think 5 years from now,
I think there's a bit of a tide that is coming in that is pushing consumers away from mass social media and more towards micro climates, little tribes that have an intense fanaticism for something. And I think the place that I see that play out the most is really Discord. And I think it is to a certain degree the anti-social media, but the intensity, the vibrancy of Discord is really shocking if you dive in deep. And the amount of interaction, that like the volume of content that's being created on Discord is shocking. I mean, it is unbelievable. So I think if I were to place my bets, knowing what I know now, which granted, I'm not a marketing professional, so I may be missing something really obvious. But from my vantage point, Discord would be the next big opportunity that is, as of yet, in my opinion, truly, truly well tapped.
That's a great answer, and it's fascinating. And now I have to go learn more about Discord because I feel all of a sudden very undereducated on that platform. No, that's awesome. Okay, last one, kind of a two-parter. What are the most overrated and underrated trends in marketing today?
Ooh.
What are people spending more time and money on than they should, and not as much?
Again, yeah, difficult questions to pose to someone who is not a marketing professional. But I will.
Okay, how about this? We can make it in the context of technology.
Okay.
Why don't we do that?
Okay. That's
same question in the context of technology.
Okay, great. I think that there's a certain herd mentality that drives a lot of business decision making. And I think when it comes to, and this might be an answer for both marketing and technology to a certain degree, there's an overemphasis on the influencer. And I think influencer marketing is phenomenal in many ways, but it's becoming so oversaturated, and it is becoming such a business that there is actually a blowback, and there's this countercultural shift that I think is taking place. It's not unlike what happened to YouTube when it went from true UGC to, I would say, professionalized content. And you lose a lot of, like Mr. Beast and some others that survive that transition, that still have authentic, large-scale audiences. But along the way, I think so much of that micro-engagement got lost. And it's because the platform got commercialized. So I see the same thing happening in the influencer economy. It has become such a business that it is no longer authentically connecting with consumers in many ways. So that would be one side of the coin. The other, what people aren't taking advantage of enough, I think, is actually offline experiences. I think coming out of the pandemic, that people are still desperate for real world connections, and remote work even magnifies that reality because so many of us have none of the day-to-day interaction that we did 3 or 4 years ago. I think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for marketers to lever real world experiences to create fierce loyalty to a brand. But I don't think it necessarily has to be large scale. I think it can be really small scale, hyper targeted, and geolocal to a certain degree.
That's awesome. I love both those answers. Brady, this has been great. Thanks so much for being on.
Thank you, John. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Nexus Project. If we referenced anything in terms of links, etc., they should be in the show notes. Make sure to subscribe so you get all the episodes in your feed. And if you wouldn't mind leaving us a rating or review, that would be super helpful. Last but not least, share this with a friend or a colleague that you think might get value out of it. And I will see you on the next episode.